and welcome to the last lecture for the semester. Today we will be discussing animal behavior. I've got the whiteboard here. We've used that a lot in the past, but I don't really anticipate us having much use for it today, but we will see how things go. And let's kind of jump right in here. Animals, their actions, animal behavior. And so the field of animal behavior is fairly broad. And believe it or not, many of you may have already taken a class in animal behavior, even if you didn't recognize it. How many of you out there have taken psychology? Psychology really is simply the animal behavior of humans. And so psychology is really a sub-discipline of animal behavior, which is a sub-discipline of biology. And so some of the themes that we'll encounter today, well particular to animals, those will be our examples, you can actually think about them in the context of humans as well. For instance, things like learning and conditioning are things that go on in humans. So, 3 principal questions in the field of animal behavior. We have, what do animals do? Why do they do it? And how do they manage to do it? And those are important questions. This one is basically the basic observation. It's basically saying, okay, we see an animal do something. It's almost like you could think of it like collecting data. But then you would use that data to answer questions. And the 2 main questions in the field of animal behavior are why questions and how questions. And we call these proximate and ultimate causes. The proximate cause of something will be the immediate reason, and oftentimes this is for instance physiology. So if I hit you in the knee with a hammer, like when you're at the doctor's testing your reflexes and your knee goes up, that's because there is a very proximate cause. Your body takes in a stimuli and has a response. For instance, if you see, let me move on to ultimate actually. Ultimate causes are why answers, or evolutionary answers for the most part. And so for any given behavior, we can find a proximate and ultimate cause. And so let's take some deer, for example, during mating season. Deer are engaging in mating behaviors. And you could explain their engagement in mating behaviors by looking at how hormone levels in their body are changing. So the fact that testosterone levels start to rise in the male deer, encouraging them to fight, would be a proximate cause. It's the actual physiology of what's driving the behavior. The ultimate cause of that would be evolutionary, though. It would be evolutionary because those deer that are driven to engage in the mating behavior have greater reproductive success, and therefore deer have evolved to engage in this behavior during mating season. And so for almost every behavior, we can come up with both a proximate cause and an ultimate cause. And as mentioned before, this can come out through natural selection. And this is where we get most of our very obvious and established behaviors from. So what actually influences behavior? Well, we've got genes, learning, and an animal's environment work together to produce a given behavior. And so what we have here is, you'll notice, genes and environment, but really learning is something that occurs in that environment. And so if we wanted to look at this, behavior is like any other trait we've studied this semester. Your phenotype is a function of genetics and the environment. And it's tough to think about sometimes because we want to say that, anybody's capable of anything and those sorts of concepts. But we all know we're all different genetically. And so, for instance, what are the odds that you will be a player in the NBA? Probably a lot lower if you're genetically short. And so the same thing goes for behaviors. Some people tend to be naturally more aggressive. Some people tend to be naturally more passive. And so you get a kind of a genetic basis when you're born for your behavior. But then, as you develop, as time goes on, you have environmental influences that come into that. So if what we were doing was measuring a person's aggression, people may be genetically inclined to be aggressive, but if their whole lives in their environment they're taught that aggression is bad and they're taught to be very passive, then their phenotype may end up relatively passive even though they still have this genetic basis. And so both these factors will interact with each other to determine a person's behavioral phenotype. A great example of this is some studies that have been done in prison that show that the areas of people's brains associated with aggression tend to be larger in individuals in prison than in the general population, with the idea being that those people had a genetic predisposition to be aggressive, which is perhaps what ended up influencing their going to prison. And you may have heard this in a behavioral context before, called nature versus nurture. Where the nature would be how somebody's born, but nurture would be how they're raised that ultimately influences their behavior. And it's the same for any other trait. Oftentimes things are just more complicated when we're talking about behaviors, because behaviors can be very elaborate and complex. A person's height is their height. How a person acts, there's a million different ways you can think to measure that. So we have this web of behavioral influences. We're going to skip this part on reflexes. Action patterns are things that we find, they're linked sets of behavior that are rigidly defined and largely influenced by genes, but can be modified by sensory input. And the example they always give of action patterns in classic behavior textbooks is this goose here. And what's going on is this goose has eggs. And if there is an egg over here, this goose will work to move that egg back to be with all the others. And it's a very programmed response. They see the egg, they go, they move it. And why would they have such a programmed response for this to happen? Well, as it turns out, you can imagine evolutionarily, those geese that moved an egg back into their nest when it was outside had greater reproductive success. If they don't move that egg back inside, they have one less offspring, less fitness, and so those that did do this behavior had greater fitness. Now what's interesting about this is that you can get certain species of geese to do this with any round white object. And so, for instance, scientists working with these, they put ping pong balls out here, move them back in. They try putting softballs, volleyballs, a huge volleyball, they would almost have to get on top of it to move it back. And they would even try bowling balls, where the duck was kind of working really hard to get that sucker back in. Because the ducks, any round white object outside the nest should be put back in, and it triggers that behavior. And that's basically what's known as a releaser. And so I just gave you an example with ducks, but oftentimes animals just use simple rules of thumb to make their decisions on how to work in the world. Because if you think about it, the world's so diverse, so complex, it might be easier to just take a few simple pieces of information to have the appropriate response. Because if you try to take in too much information, maybe your response is delayed. So, for instance, imagine that you're a prey animal and you see something that looks like a fox. You don't want to sit there and take the time to analyze, oh, gee, that looks like a fox, I better run away. You want to go ahead and run away immediately, because to delay and process and look for more information would not be helpful to your fitness. You might be dead. And so in the stickleback example, what we see here is we have a situation with the stickleback responds to something else that looks like another stickleback. It'll have a threat posture. But if there's no red underside, it doesn't respond, because perhaps that just means, oh, it's another fish. And so what's really important for the fish is the shading. That difference in color that says, hey, this is a member of my species. That's an individual that I should have a threat posture to, because I want them to stay out of my area. Moving on, orientation behaviors. Orientation behaviors can be learned, but they also have a strong genetic component. As you might imagine, everything is genetics and environmental influences. There's a genetic predisposition to move toward or away a given stimulus. It's called the taxis. You'll see some of this in the online lab, where basically taxis toward or away, you'd move, typically we think of animals moving toward things they like or are beneficial to their fitness, and moving away from things they do not like, or things that are, in other words, detrimental to their fitness. And so it's a pretty simple behavior. It's moving toward or away something. We can think of it in a broader context, though, as in migration. And so what's going on in this little experiment here is they put a bird that was migrating inside this cage, and it was going north at the time, and they put ink at the bottom of the cage, and what you see is all this ink right here, and all that ink right there is to the north. And so what this bird was doing is constantly trying to go north. It had this internal motivation or orientation to head north. We talked about positive and negative taxis. Organisms have internal clocks. These internal clocks can function independently of environmental signals, although they are oftentimes regulated by environmental signals. And so, for example, we can think of something known as like a circadian rhythm. Your circadian rhythm, or your wake-sleep cycle, everybody kind of thinks it's 24 hours. But in reality, if I was to take you and lock you in a cave, and in that cave there were no lights, and I just made you stay there for a while, what would eventually happen is that you would actually go into a 25-hour day-night cycle. But we as humans, the sun, we have a day length that actually helps to entrain our cycle to 24 hours. So your natural level might be 25, but you'll operate at 24 with input from the sun. Some people have suggested this may be the reason why there is the phenomenon of people in far northern latitudes where they don't get a constant day-night cycle going a little bit nuts. Some people call it seasonal affective disorder or something like that. And it could be simply because they've got this base signal, but they're not getting the right amount of light. Hormones have incredible influences on behavior. You guys in your health classes have probably learned about, say, the links between testosterone and aggression, for instance. But these hormones can be involved in a lot of different ways and have very powerful influences on animal behavior. And so here is an example of a bird, how frequently or loud they sing, whatever song level is on this axis over here. And so what you see is the singing in the bird tracks very reliably with the amount of testosterone. And in fact, if I was to grab this bird, even when it wasn't in reproductive season, inject it with a bunch of testosterone, it would be induced to start singing all the time. So for instance, we know that there's a big event of mating in April. If in December I jacked up that testosterone level, this bird would start singing. And hormones have a great many influences on behavior, and they can really affect what organisms do and how they do it. It's a very proximal cause in those behaviors. Let's move on to learning and behavior. Learning is acquisition of knowledge through experience. And although it's based on experience that comes from an animal in the outside world, it always has a genetic component to it. So an organism's ability to learn has a genetic basis. So for instance, you can only teach a dog tricks that are so elaborate. There's some limit based on that dog's genetic predisposition for learning that limit what it can do. Its brain power, so to speak, may not be enough to do something like, I don't want to give you a crazy example, but you get the idea, to do something very elaborate. One form of learning is habituation, and habituation is reduction in a response based on repeated exposure to a stimulus that has no positive or negative consequences. All right, so this is kind of a weird one because habituation, people sometimes think that it's animals making mistakes, okay? And they're really not. Habituation is learning in such a way that animals are still maximizing their fitness. Here's why. Let me give you an example. Have you ever been on a campus, say at your local Ivy Tech, and you've got squirrels or rabbits around that campus? Some of your campuses may, some might not, but you may have seen this other places. And on a college campus, you can oftentimes get very, very close. Let's say here's our squirrel or rabbit over here. Very, very close to the squirrel or rabbit before they run away. And so I've seen people be able to stand right next to some animals that aren't doing anything. And the reason is they become habituated to the presence of people walking by them all the time. And what happened is that you had these squirrels and people were walking by them all the time. So every time they got up and ran away from a person and then waited to go back out and get food, they were missing out on opportunities to get food. And every time a person walked by and they ran away and did that, they realized, hey, nothing bad ever happened. Nobody ever chased me. So while the squirrels on college campuses are very young, they learn not to run from humans. But here's a little experiment you can try on your campus. Next time you're walking by and you see one of those squirrels or rabbits that seems very comfortable around people, just suddenly stop, turn, and run at it. And what you will find is that squirrel's behavior will change very dramatically. It will, in fact, run from you because it's habituated to you walking by. It's not stupid. If you start chasing it, it will, in fact, begin to run away. So that's habituation. Classical conditioning, this is more something that you cover a lot in Psych 101, but it's basically associating a response with a stimulus. And this is kind of, you can think of this as the artificial version. And so, for instance, if every time you open the lid to your fish tank and the fish go to the surface, that may be because the fish have learned that when that fish tank is open, food's going to rain down. And there's no real reason why in nature you would ever expect food to be associated with a lid opening, but they learned that. Lid open, food, so as soon as you open the lid, even if you're not going to feed them, they go to the top because they get used to it. This is a little bit along the lines of what we're going to see here next, which is operant conditioning, which is trial and error learning, in which animals learn to associate their own actions with a particular outcome. And this is how you might think most things would learn in nature. They would experience something, and they'd find out if I do X, then Y occurs. Now keep in mind, there are some things that the rule of thumb is don't test it out, right? We gave that example of predators, right? If you're going to be learning about will that thing kill me or not, that's not a good thing to try to learn. Your natural instinct, your genetically inclined behavior should be when something's running at you to run away. You might learn otherwise through something like habituation. But operant conditioning might be if you go to an area and you find lots of food, then why not go back there again? So for instance, crows learn to love to dig at garbage cans, right? Because what they learn is that if I go to a garbage can, every time I've done that, I've gotten food, which is a fitness reward, so I'm going to do that again. Imitation. We tend to see imitation in animals with higher brain function, and this is also where we see things like insight learning. And so what they're showing you here is you've got a chimpanzee that might somehow learn to stack boxes to get bananas or get them with a stick or something like that. It's definitely a more advanced form of learning. All right, let's look at an example of behavior in action, how birds acquire their song. And bird songs are under genetic influence, but the ones they learn come about through the ones they hear when they're growing up. And so here's an example of two white-crowned sparrows. You can almost think that these are like different languages. These are just patterns or frequencies of a song. So this would be like, I actually can't read these very well, but you could imagine they look different. And so they are different songs. And what will happen is when a white-crowned sparrow is born in a region, it learns that song. If I take a white-crowned sparrow from one region and one from other and swap them, they'll both learn the songs from the region they're in. The region they're in. The propensity to sing is genetic. And in fact, there's some genetic song that they'll just default to if you rear them without any songs. But they'll learn the ones of the region they're in. And there's a good reason for that, because that means that sons learn their father's song, because their father's out singing it when they're there, and the daughters prefer to mate with males that sing a song similar to their father's. And so this ensures that birds and regions are mating with each other within their same species. And we already talked about that. Social behavior. Some animals live in almost complete isolation from other members of their species, where others are never far from other members of their species. And animals who live with other members are exhibiting social behavior. They're interacting with each other, but these social behaviors always have costs as well as benefits. And so a species will only exhibit social behavior to the degree that that behavior aids in their own individual survival and reproduction. So you may see animals, and it may look like they're being nice to each other, but really what's going on is each of them is acting in accordance with a set of rules that help it to maximize their own fitness. And so keep this slide in mind here for a moment, because what we'll do is we'll get back to this part in a moment when we talk about altruism at the end of this presentation. So we will revisit this again. So, another feature we find a lot in organisms are dominance hierarchies, where certain organisms are in charge over others. And what this helps to do is, could you imagine if every time two organisms met each other, they had to fight to decide who was boss? And if you've ever seen dogs get in a fight or something like that, they can be pretty nasty. And so the idea here is that two organisms can establish who's more important than the other. And so if there's food around, who's going to get it first? If there's mates around, who's going to get them first? And what this means is they avoid costly fights with each other all the time. And so what happens is every organism has their rank and knows the pecking order, so to speak. This is important because, again, like I said, it might be costly. There's risk of injury. There's energy that go into fights, so you can establish it. Now, keep in mind, a dominance hierarchy can be broken. All right? You may have a dominant male, for instance. You see this a lot of, like, with lions or gorillas in nature documentaries. And, you know, this one's in charge, and then the younger one's kind of an upstart. And that upstart may come and become dominant, may bring this one down, may raise itself up to a higher level. But for the most part, all the time up until then, this guy's been dominant. This guy's been submissive to that one. Along the lines of dominance hierarchies, we have territoriality. What territoriality is going to do is it's where an organism will try to maintain control of an area. And so when we think about territoriality, there's a lot of different organisms that we think about. But think about wolves for a second. Wolves, by maintaining a territory, control that area, and they control the resources in that area. And so by controlling those resources, they're able to ensure that there's likely to be food for them anytime they go out hunting. What's really interesting about something like wolves is controlling it is really important because they have to manage the fear in their prey. You can imagine, let's say, Yellowstone, and you've got a bunch of elk out, right? And those elk are worried about getting killed by wolves. So they're looking around all the time. Is there a wolf that's going to get me? Something like that. Well, if you as a wolf did not have a territory, any other wolves could come in and scare those elk. And if those other wolves come in and scare those elk, when you go to look for them, they'll all be afraid and waiting, knowing there's a predator around. So wolves really try to control their territories, not just to make sure there's the actual elk, the actual food is there, but to manage the fear in their prey. And so when we have territoriality, when we have dominance hierarchies, we rarely see things like fights to the death. Those sorts of things do not occur that often. And there's a pretty good reason for that. It's because organisms risk a lot if they were going to fight to the death, right? Think about it. If you die, your fitness from that point forward is 0. And so there's very little incentive to actually harm each other during these fights. This is why we get things like displays and threat behaviors that result in one determining who's dominant without the fight being that bad. And here's the other thing. Let's say that some organisms were to fight to the death. So 2 organisms meet, they fight, one of them dies. Unless there is some huge advantage to killing the other organism, such as controlling a resource that you didn't before or something like that, that fight was kind of pointless. Because if, let's say, there's bears, and there's 100 bears in the area, and one bear fights another one to the death, well, yeah, sure, it got a little bit of a benefit, but so did the other 98 bears that were out there. And so it took all this risk to get everybody a reward. And so most organisms, when they encounter each other, will have stereotype fights at a very low level, or even just displays that ensure that they don't hurt each other. Eusociality, they call this truly social species. That's not exactly what the definition always means. You can kind of think of it more like extremely social. And oftentimes these look like things that are involved in cooperative care, where there's some young and everybody contributing to those young. So for instance, we've got things like honeybees and the naked mole rat, which is this guy here, that will all work together. Now, keep in mind, the weird thing about these species is that we see, like in ants, you've heard about a worker ant that never mates, right? And it looks like a totally eusocial species. That worker ant is going to give its life to support the queen. However, I don't want to get into it here. We don't have time. The reason that occurs is because of a very unusual genetic system whereby the fitness of that individual ant is greatest if it supports the queen, and more so or greater than if it was to mate itself. It's kind of confusing. Don't worry about it. Just know that's weird. Because I would rather talk about this in terms of altruism. All right. What is altruism? This is a behavior that when you first look at it would appear like a selfless act. And so what it looks like is that this organism is sacrificing some of its fitness to benefit another organism. However, this is not always, in fact, it's almost really never the case. What we find when we look at altruistic behaviors is that in the end, on average, they benefit the fitness of the individual engaging in them. And one of the ways this happens is through the principle of inclusive fitness. And inclusive fitness deals with the idea that you are genetically related to your relatives. And so you are more likely to engage in a behavior that helps your relative's fitness than you would be a complete stranger or an individual who was not related to you. And the reason is because you share genetics. If your brother or sister reproduces, you also get a fitness advantage because you share genes, so some of the genes they pass on are genes that are similar to yours. And so, who would you be more likely to lend money? A total stranger or your brother or sister? Okay, well, now maybe you've learned something from your brother or sister and you're less inclined to give them some money. But on average, we would think that people would be more likely to loan money to a family member. Why? Because they have a shared genetic interest. And really, that's all what you know as love between family members. That's a large part of that. That love is there. That willingness to sacrifice, to get along, to accept them no matter what, is because you have a shared genetic relationship. And so by engaging in behaviors with them that can promote them, you promote yourselves a little bit. Another great example of things they were calling altruistic was in things like prairie dogs. Or there's been examples of similar organisms on the Discovery Channel and things lately that you'll have one individual who's standing out being a sentinel. And what that one's going to do is when a predator comes, they are going to make a call and save everybody around them. But what you find when you look at that situation is something pretty interesting. The one who's acting as sentinel, who's sacrificing going out to eat, to be the lookout, is oftentimes the one with the highest energetic state, or the one who has just recently eaten the most. So their belly's full. They couldn't get much more food anyway. Also, that one who's this lookout, the sentinel, happens to be the one that's best able to get away from the predator because they're looking out for everybody else. And so we can also have this altruism come about in terms of reciprocal altruism. In this case, the animals will exhibit reciprocal altruism because they'll take turns. Kind of like, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. Like, for instance, grooming that you've seen in primates as literally scratching their backs. What you have is a case where one individual is going to act in a way that looks like they're sacrificing their fitness. They're going to spend time and energy to groom this one. And so that would appear altruistic, except for the fact that the other one is going to give them that behavior back. They're going to say, all right, well, you groom me, now I'm going to groom you. Everything's fair. It's equal. We both got a benefit. We both had a loss because we spent some time, but it's equal. However, you might notice something here. And what you might notice is that, what if you didn't groom the other one back? What if what happened in this situation was you let everybody groom you all the time. They took the bugs and stuff off of you. You're doing good. And you never spent your time grooming them. Well, what would happen is you should technically have a higher fitness. Right? If you're not going to waste your time and energy to devote it to another organism, your fitness should be higher. And this is why there has to be some sort of punishment when individuals don't follow the rules. Because evolutionarily, there is always an incentive to be a cheater. Let's use another example. Let's say the idea was this group of organisms shared food. And every time you found food, you're supposed to make a call, and everybody comes to get the food. Well, any individual who found food and kept it all to themselves would have higher fitness. And so what we oftentimes perceive as altruistic behaviors and things like that are difficult to evolve and end up having to be based on this idea of relationship or reciprocal cooperation. Because normally, sacrificing one's own fitness in order to benefit the common good is not a good strategy to maximize your fitness. Sacrificing your fitness, it's right in there in the statement. It's bad. And so most examples we see of altruism actually provide a greater benefit to the organism engaging in them, or there will be some reciprocal event down the road. And so that is our last slide for today. And it brings us to the end of our Biology 101 lectures for the semester. I hope that you've enjoyed looking at these, and we've tried to repeat some common themes throughout the semester. And I really like this last one because it really brings back a lot of topics like hormones and evolution and things that we've seen from before. And so with that, I'm going to turn off the camera and say good luck on your test 4 and your final exam.